Good morning, everyone, or good evening if you're on the other side of the world, as often happens. So this morning we'll be continuing with our 5-talk series on Introduction to Buddhist Meditation. So hello so far to Gita Jnana, Kauser Friend, Alexandra, Jens, Denise, Adine, Venerable Vimala Jnani, good to see you, and Kyle. So welcome everyone. So I'll start by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So I've spoken a fair bit about samadhi practice already. So today I'd like to pay a little more attention to the development of insight, which in Pali is commonly called vipassana, which is used for the cultivation of liberating wisdom. So wisdom, panya. Or another way this is described in the suttas is through the phrase yatha bhutang jnana dasanam, which means knowing and seeing things as they are. And before starting in that, I think it's useful to first talk a little bit about panya, wisdom. One of the frameworks of the development of wisdom, which I find really helpful, is the 3 stages of wisdom: suttamaya panya, chintamaya panya, and bhavanamaya panya. So I speak about this triad from time to time because I do find it really helpful in coming to a better understanding of just what it is we're trying to achieve and how to go about cultivating wisdom. So first off, suttamaya panya. Sutta literally means heard or learned. Maya means created or produced by. And panya means wisdom. So suttamaya panya means the wisdom produced by learning, by listening to the Dhamma, by reading Dhamma texts, by, most importantly, by reading the scriptures, by reading the suttas. Despite the similarity in sound, by the way, the words sutta and sutta have absolutely no relation to each other. So don't get the 2 mixed up. So sutta with 1 T means listened or heard or learned. Sutta with 2 T's means thread and is used to refer to the Buddha's discourses. So no relation between these words, although they sound very similar. So suttamaya panya, the wisdom produced by learning. So this is the first stage in the development of wisdom. So one starts by reading the suttas. So this is something which I keep saying over and over and over again, and I really do mean it when I say it. Read all of the suttas. Cover to cover, don't skip anything. Read all of the suttas. And your understanding of what the Buddhist path is, how to practice, and what we're trying to achieve will be vastly improved by having read through the suttas. So here at the monastery, over the last couple of months, one of our residents read through the entire Anguttara Nikaya and Samyutta Nikaya, was it? Yeah, both the Anguttara Nikaya and the Samyutta Nikaya in just a couple of months. So it really doesn't take long. You just need to make the commitment to read a bit every day and stick to that commitment. So in order to cultivate wisdom, we have to understand what it is we're trying to cultivate. If you want to get to a particular destination, you need to know where that destination is. So this is actually quite important. It's not so easy to just sit down and close your eyes and expect for the entire body of the Buddha's wisdom to just magically appear in your mind. It's not that straightforward. If it was that straightforward, then the world would be overflowing with enlightened beings by now. It'd be difficult to find an unenlightened being if just any random person could just spontaneously happen upon the entire breadth of a Buddha's wisdom without any prior knowledge or prior study. In fact, the Buddhist discourses emphasize how incredibly difficult it is to arrive at awakening without proper instruction. They emphasize how incredibly rare it is to encounter a self-awakened being, given how extraordinarily difficult it is. So then to think that we're the rare exceptional person who's somehow going to attain enlightenment without knowing what the Buddha taught is just utter foolishness. It's just ridiculous. Unless you've taken a vow to become a Pacceka Buddha or a Sammasambuddha, in which case, well, good luck, because you're going to need it. And secondly, be prepared to wait a really long time. These things don't happen quickly. Developing the qualities to become a Pacceka Buddha or a Sammasambuddha takes hundreds of lifetimes, thousands of lifetimes, millions of lifetimes. You better develop some patience because you've got a long path ahead of you, which is fine. I mean, I commend you if that's what you're doing. It's a very honorable and respectable determination. But yeah, it's probably not going to be in this life. So Sutta Panya, we read the suttas, and we listen to Dhamma talks, and we have conversations about Dhamma. And this starts to develop in our mind an intellectual framework, an intellectual map of what the Dhamma is and what it's aimed at. So this is the intellectual level of wisdom. And as we start to accumulate knowledge of the Dhamma, accumulate knowledge of what the path is and what the goal of the path is, then we ponder it. We think about it. We contemplate it. We mentally investigate it and consider it deeply. So this is also a very important stage in the development of wisdom, which is not to be skipped over. Again, many people seem to think that if they just sit down and silence their mind, that they'll just magically attain enlightenment. That wisdom will just magically appear all of its own accord. And again, this is usually not the way things work. By contrast, what we see in the suttas is actually the Buddha talks about how before his own enlightenment, he spent a lot of time thinking and pondering the nature of the world and the nature of the mind and the nature of suffering and the nature of delusion. He spent a lot of time thinking about these things, not sitting silently and waiting for things to magically appear. He actually thought about it and contemplated it and considered them deeply. So Chintamaya Panya is where we take the information that we've gathered and we really think deeply about its implications and its meanings. And this also is quite important. I've met a number of people over the years who they read a lot of suttas and read a lot of Dhamma books and listen to a lot of Dhamma talks, but they don't ever seem to actually think about the information that they've accumulated. They have the data in their mind, and if you ask them questions, sometimes they can regurgitate some of that data for you. But they don't really seem to understand what it's talking about. They don't really seem to understand the essence of it. So Chentamaya Panya is about deeply pondering and contemplating and considering what's the meaning of the Buddha's words? What's he pointing at? How do we practice? How do we come to a direct experience? And Chentamaya Panya is greatly supported by discussions, by the way, by conversation. So discussion can be a function of Suttamaya Panya, a way of developing, of collecting information, but it can also be a way of fleshing out and deepening our Chintamaya Panya, our wisdom that comes from contemplating, from thinking. So discussions about the Dhamma and even friendly debates about the Dhamma can be a really valuable way of sparking our mind of contemplation, our mind of careful investigation. So that's of great value, to spend time discussing the Dhamma with others. And it's also very useful for helping to remove our own delusions. One of the problems that we come to in approaching the Dhamma is that we have layer after layer after layer of subconscious bias and pre-existing opinion. And whether we recognize it or not, we are usually reading the Dhamma through the lens of our pre-existing opinions. We're looking at the Dhamma through the lens of our subconscious beliefs, our subconscious biases and prejudices and tendencies. And it's very difficult to see that on our own. But through discussion and conversation with others, it can help to illuminate where our subconscious biases and beliefs are getting in the way of actually seeing what the Buddha was talking about. Other people are usually much more aware of our biases than we are ourselves. They're much more aware of our implicit beliefs and opinions than we are ourselves. And for this, it's particularly useful to have conversations with people who are somewhat different from ourselves. So people who have different backgrounds, different upbringings, different cultures, different ethnicities, different Buddhist traditions. So getting a broader view, both from outside and inside of Buddhism, can be really helpful in helping to suss out where our subconscious biases and opinions are getting in the way. So discussion is incredibly helpful for developing Chintamaya Panya. And this then forms the basis for the third kind of wisdom, Bhavanamaya Panya. So the wisdom that comes from developing, from practicing. So as I mentioned on the first day, the word the Buddha most commonly used for meditation practice was bhavana, which literally means bringing into being. So bringing into being wholesome states of mind. So Bhavanamaya Panya then is the wisdom that comes from practicing what the Buddha taught. So the first stage is learning what the Buddha taught. The second stage is contemplating what the Buddha taught. And the third stage is practicing what the Buddha taught, putting it into practice, which is the path of Buddhist practice. So it's the Noble Eightfold Path. It's the threefold training. This is what we mean by practicing the Buddha's teachings. And from that arises experiential wisdom, experiential understanding. So Bhavanamaya Panya then is the practice of generosity, morality, mindfulness, concentration, and insight. So the Buddhist practices which lead to wisdom, to understanding. So what is it that we're trying to understand? Well, read the suttas and then check back with me after you're done, and we can have a actually good conversation about it. But in the meantime, I'll just say some things at you. So what are we trying to understand? Well, first off, we're trying to understand dukkha. What is dukkha? What is the experience of dukkha? What causes dukkha? What is dukkha like when it's arising? And what is dukkha like when it's diminishing or fading or passing away? And what causes dukkha to diminish and fade and cease? What are we doing that's causing dukkha to diminish? So this is contemplating the Four Noble Truths. And again, the Four Noble Truths, if you just take it on the level of Sutta Maya Panya, then you're like, oh, I already know the Four Noble Truths. I learned about that in high school. Well, that's great. I'm happy that you know the Four Noble Truths on an intellectual level. Have you taken the time to really deeply think about it, though? I've met a lot of people who they can recite the Four Noble Truths, but they don't yet seem to understand that all their suffering is self-created. They still go around blaming the outside world. They're like, oh, I'm suffering because I didn't like breakfast this morning. I'm suffering because that person was rude to me. I'm suffering because my cat is sick. I'm suffering because the water tastes funny. I'm suffering because the flowers are old. I'm suffering because my glasses are out of date. I'm suffering because fill in the blank. People always pick some excuse, something to blame their suffering on. And they're completely missing the fact that the only person they can blame is themselves. Why do you suffer? You. That's why. You suffer because of you. That's the truth of the matter. It's nobody else's fault. It's not the fault of the breakfast soup. It's not the fault of the cat. It's not the fault of your neighbor. It's not the fault of your body. It's not the fault of your society. It's your own damn fault. Let's just be realistic. That's why you suffer. So we come to this through Chintamaya Panya, through contemplating and thinking deeply, pondering deeply on the Four Noble Truths. And eventually we come to the inevitable conclusion that suffering is our own fault. We are creating our own suffering, and we can bring an end to our own suffering if we start to change the way we think and act. So this is getting to a deeper level of understanding. But at that point, we're still suffering. We have a better intellectual idea of why we're suffering, but we're still suffering. So then it's necessary to actually practice. So first off, to face dukkha. So one practice which I really highly recommend everyone to do is what you might call mindfulness of dukkha. Look for the feeling of dukkha. What does dukkha feel like? Bring attention to your experience of dukkha. What is dukkha? How does it feel? Where is it? What texture is it? I can feel it right now. What's it like? Don't turn away from it. Turn towards it. Don't try to ignore it or hide it. Bring it into the open and look closely. What is dukkha? Familiarize yourself with dukkha. It's always there. Always, always, always there. The only beings who don't experience dukkha are Buddhas, arhants, enlightened beings. They're the only ones. Everybody else experiences dukkha all the time. It's your one friend that never leaves you. Your frenemy. It's always there. So pay attention to it. Get familiar with it. Know it inside and out, thoroughly and completely. This is a form of vipassana meditation. It's a form of insight practice that leads to insight. The deep understanding of the First Noble Truth. Again, you can just go around parroting edang dukkang. Well, okay, that's great. You can say this is suffering. That's nice. But do you know what that means? Well, you think more deeply about it and you get some intellectual understanding of what dukkha means. Well, that's a step in the right direction. But when you look directly at your own dukkha and you feel it completely and thoroughly without turning away, and you know directly, this is dukkha. This feeling right now, this is dukkha. Then finally you understand. Finally, you're starting to understand what dukkha actually is. And that's bhavana maya panya. That's true wisdom. That's true insight. And a deep understanding of dukkha is the first step towards liberation. And similarly with the other three of the Four Noble Truths, these are not meant just to be doctrinal sets that you print out and post on your wall somewhere, or just something that you blindly recite in the mornings. It's meant to be something that we look for deeply in our own experience and try to understand through direct experience. So pay close attention. What is the experience of dukkha arising? What is the experience of dukkha coming into being and increasing and swelling and growing? What's that experience like? And what causes it? What causes dukkha to arise? Again, I'm not looking for an intellectual answer, because if you've been studying Buddhism for 5 minutes, you can already say an intellectual answer to these questions. But rather, I'm encouraging you to really look deeply at your own experience. What is the cause of dukkha? What is the experience of dukkha arising and increasing? And what is its immediate cause? Really pay close attention to this. Get a feel for it. Not just a thought for it, but a feel for it. And similarly, the cessation of dukkha. So dukkha is constantly arising and ceasing. It's constantly growing and diminishing, increasing and decreasing, moment by moment. It's always coming and going, arising and ceasing. So the cessation of dukkha is something that you can notice whenever you choose to pay attention to it, because it's actually happening all the time. I remember one teacher many years ago called it micro cessation. So macro cessation of dukkha is when you attain full enlightenment. Micro cessation of dukkha is what happens every moment that you let go of a little bit of craving. You drop a little bit of craving and you get a little bit of cessation of dukkha. So you can actually get mini dukkha cessation, so chula dukkha nirodha. You can get that in every moment if you're paying attention. And actually it's happening all the time. It's just normally we're so fixated on the next thing that we want that we miss the fact that the dukkha associated with the previous want has faded away. But we're so fixated on what we want next and the dukkha that's coming up with the new wanting that we totally miss the cessation of dukkha that's happening. So start paying attention. What does it feel like? The cessation of dukkha. The diminishing of dukkha, the decrease of dukkha. What does it feel like? And what's causing it? What are we doing that's bringing about the diminishing and decreasing of dukkha? And this leads naturally into the direct contemplation of the fourth noble truth, the practices which lead to the diminishing of dukkha, the cessation of dukkha. What are we doing that causes dukkha to diminish and decrease and cease? Again, this is something to pay attention to feel directly, to know intimately and thoroughly through direct experience. So this is then a Vipassana meditation technique. It's an insight meditation practice. The direct experience of the Four Noble Truths, direct contemplation of the Four Noble Truths. So then on the first day, I spoke about the three misperceptions. So the misperception of conditional happiness, the misperception of permanence, and the misperception of self-identity. And how these three misperceptions then are the foundation of all of our misery and torment and confusion and delusion. And that then to counter that, we work on developing the three wise perceptions. The perception of dukkha, the perception of impermanence, and the perception of not self. So the direct contemplation of the Four Noble Truths is one way of practicing the perception of dukkha, the recognition of dukkha. That's one way of developing a wise, insightful realization of the true nature of dukkha. There's many other ways, but this is one way that I've always particularly liked and had much benefit from. And it's something that you can do all the time, by the way. Not just when you're sitting down or doing walking meditation, but all the time in any activity. Just constantly ask yourself, where is the dukkha? What is the dukkha in this moment? Turning your mind towards the dukkha and noticing its arising and its cessation, and applying the Buddha's teachings and noticing how that leads to the diminishing of dukkha. You can do this all the time. And of course, it can also be done during periods of formal meditation. The Buddha also recommends a number of other ways of cultivating the perception of dukkha. One which I actually find quite delightful is from the Girimananda Sutta. In the Girimananda Sutta, the Buddha gives 10 meditation practices. And one of them is to reflect on the nature of the body, thinking, oh, this body has much dukkha, many drawbacks. It's prone to all kinds of horrible diseases. And then the Buddha gives this long list of diseases. He's like, there's eye diseases, and there's ear diseases, and there's nose diseases, and there's tongue diseases, and there's body diseases, and there's mouth diseases, and there's stomach diseases, and there's jaundice, and there's cancer, and he just goes on and on and on and on and on. And you're just like, okay, I get it. But we clearly don't get it. So actually really contemplating the fact that having our self-identity tied to a physical body is a source of a tremendous amount of suffering. Really getting that through, because we clearly subconsciously believe otherwise. Subconsciously, we have an incredibly deep attachment to this body and our personal self-identity with this body. So clearly we haven't quite gotten yet that this body is one big heap of dukkha. Clearly we haven't gotten that yet. We think we understand that intellectually, but clearly we don't understand it any deeper than that. So actually really contemplating this body, not as a source of pleasure, but as a source of suffering. Contemplate identification with the body, not as a source of happiness, but as a source of misery. And you'll realize it's always been this way. It's never been otherwise. We just keep trying to hide from this fact. We think that hiding from this fact will make us happy, but actually it does the opposite. Hiding from this fact makes us uncomfortable. Paying attention to this fact brings joy. One of the remarkable aspects of the Buddha's teachings. Something like paying attention to the drawbacks of the body actually makes you joyful. Isn't that interesting? The second of these three wise perceptions, this actually is my favorite of the three, and it's the one which historically I've spent the most time with and had the most benefit from, is the recognition of impermanence, the recognition that all things are impermanent, insubstantial, constantly changing. They have no lasting essence, no inherent existence of their own. So this practice, one reason I like it is because it builds really nicely on samadhi practice. But also because it starts to disintegrate in a very tangible way. It starts to disintegrate the basis of dukkha. Dukkha is tied to objects. When we recognize that objects are impermanent and insubstantial, constantly breaking up and dissolving, not really there in the first place, then dukkha has no place to land. no place to arise. Dukkha can only arise in conditional phenomena. So if all conditional phenomena are insubstantial, that means dukkha is insubstantial as well. It's actually great. It's really lovely. If you're willing to let go of all things, then you will automatically also let go of all dukkha. By default, it comes together. So the perception of impermanence, that's actually not a complicated practice at all. Again, one thing I really like about both jhana practice, samadhi practice, and the perception of impermanence is that both of them are extremely simple, straightforward practices. They're not complicated. They're not particularly easy, but they're not complicated. So when the mind is settled and alert, pay attention to the constant change in all sensations. Pay attention to the fact that every single part of your experience is in flux. Every single part of body and mind is constantly changing. Every single part of body and mind is insubstantial. All of it, without exception. There are no separate objects. There is only the temporary illusion of separate objects. Nothing has any real lasting existence of its own. Nothing at all. And you can cultivate this as a direct experience. And the easiest way to start with this is by practicing mindfulness of the body. And when you have a clear, alert, attentive awareness of your body, recognize that it's constantly changing. And if you do this with sincerity, then your whole body can disappear. Because in fact, there never was a body here in the first place. There was only the illusion of a body, generated by the false belief in permanence. So our false belief in permanence generates the false experience of permanent ongoing objects, such as what we think is our body. When we recognize that actually experience is a bunch of constantly changing, ephemeral, insubstantial sensations, then we recognize there are no persistent objects. There never were persistent objects. And the mind finally starts to relax because it doesn't need to hold on to all of this nonsense anymore. It doesn't need to go through all the effort of continuously generating a false reality of permanent things. So exhausting. It's actually mind-blowing that we're doing this to ourselves all the time. We're wasting so much effort continuously generating a sucky world to live in. Seriously, what's wrong with us? It's just mind-blowing. So the perception of impermanence works to directly counter that and allows us to finally relax into a sense of spaciousness and joy. But it can be a little scary. I've mentioned this a number of times in the past. The perception of impermanence can be a little scary. It's a bit like free fall without a parachute. Good news is there's no ground. So you're never going to have that hard impact that normally comes at the end of skydiving without a parachute. So the perception of impermanence, it's skydiving without a parachute. But the good news is there's no ground at the end. So you never have any hard impact waiting for you. There's only the fear. But it's a fear of something that's not real. It's a fear of something which exists only in our own mind. So if you can get over the fear and relax into free fall, then the perception of impermanence will produce great benefit. And you can take it as far as you need to go. And in the suttas, there's a number of places where the Buddha states that the perception of impermanence is sufficient to attain enlightenment, because it naturally brings with it also the perception of dukkha and the perception of anatta, of not self. Because we see if all things are impermanent, then trying to hold on to them brings suffering. So then the Buddha says, anicca dukkha sanya. In what is impermanent, one recognizes there is dukkha. One sees dukkha in what is impermanent. So the perception of impermanence naturally comes to an understanding of dukkha. We see that all things are inherently dukkha because they are impermanent. Therefore, they are painful when clung to, and not painful when not clung to. And if all things are impermanent, then it also means that they're not who we are. Things are constantly arising and ceasing. So who is this persistent, ongoing being that thinks it's those arising and ceasing phenomena? Can't possibly be those things because they've changed and gone and disappeared. So it can't possibly have been who this being is. So we keep looking to try to figure out who this being is, what this being is, and you can't find anything to pin it on. So the perception of impermanence naturally brings in the perception of not self. And the perception of not self, there's also many ways of practicing. The way of practicing the perception of not self that I've personally done the most often and enjoyed the most is the contemplation of the 6 elements. So the contemplation of the 6 elements, the first 4 can also be done purely as a samadhi practice. And on rare occasion, I teach it in that way. On rare occasion, I'll give instructions on using the 4 elements as a samadhi practice. But normally, I like to use the 6 elements as an insight practice, a practice for developing the recognition of not self. So there's many ways that the Buddha gives of practicing not self, and most of them start with choosing one of the frameworks for dividing experience. So whether it's the 6 elements or the 5 components of being, the 5 khandhas, or the 6 senses, or there's a few others that he gives, but these are the more common ones. So one picks one of these frameworks and then goes through piece by piece and recognizing, oh, this is not me. This is not mine. This is not who I am. This is just a aspect of the natural world. And the 6 elements I find particularly powerful for this because you can get a very tangible experience. So I think this evening I'll lead a guided meditation on the 6 elements. So one can get a very tangible experience of the impersonal nature of the body and the mind. And the 6 elements it's mostly focused on the body because that's usually the easier place to start. And that's actually a general rule with Buddhist practice, by the way. It's usually easier to start with your body. The mind is a bit harder to catch, a bit harder to trap. But the body is pretty slow moving and slow changing by comparison. So it's a bit easier to pay attention to and to see it with insight. So similarly, another way of practicing not self in relation to the body, which I've also had some success with, is to go through the body piece by piece and to recognize this is not me, this is not mine. If this was removed, would I be removed? If this was destroyed, would I be destroyed? So you look at your fingernails, beautiful fingernails, which are a little overdue for a trimming. So you look at your fingernails. I'm like, oh, look at those lovely fingernails, definitely me. But then you go in and get your nail clippers and clip, 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 and Now me is this little disgusting bit of trash on the table. It's not me anymore. The moment it's separated from the rest of the body, it's no longer me. So was it ever me? When the fingernails were connected to the body, were they me? When they're becoming disconnected, are they me? When they're disconnected, are they me? Were they ever me at any point? And the answer is clearly no. Clearly not. Or hair, if you have hair. And I shave my head pretty regularly, so I usually don't have much in the way of hair. But that's another very tangible example. When hair is connected to the body, we think it's me. But when it's disconnected from the body, then it's just trash. It's not me anymore. In truth, it never was me. It always was not me. It's just sometimes it's part of a collection of body components and sometimes it isn't. And you can do the same thing with your whole body. So going through the body piece by piece. And it's often recommended to start with the external parts of the body. Hair, nails, teeth, skin. Well, teeth is bordering on inside of the body, but you lose teeth. So we have some experience of what it's like to lose teeth without losing me, whatever me means. So starting with the more obvious parts of the external body, parts that can be removed and lost without losing me, then you can start to work on the internal parts of the body. Or another way is to do it like a butcher. If someone cuts off your fingers, does that destroy your sense of self? Does that destroy me? Is me the fingers? For example, I know a carpenter who he was cutting a plank of wood and he wasn't paying attention, and he cut off his thumb. Moral of the story, pay attention when using power tools. This is actually like the most basic lesson when I first learned how to use power tools, pay attention. Because otherwise, bad things happen. So this poor guy, he's cutting a piece of wood and whoop, off came his thumb. Yet, somehow, he continued to seem to exist. Of course, if you've got your Sutta Panya and your Chintamaya Panya going, you would know that he never existed in the first place and still doesn't exist. But he seems to exist. But clearly, he was not his thumb. So thumb is not self. We figured that one out. Well, if thumb is not self, then forefinger is probably not self. Middle finger, probably not self. Ring finger, probably not self. Hand, probably not self. Forearm, probably not self. You can go through the whole body in this way. And really trying to recognize, this is actually not me. It's not what defines me. Another practice which I find quite interesting, sometimes I've had people do this during retreat. So you sit next to another person and you both hold out your hand. And you look at the other person's hand and you have a very clear sense, that's not me. That is not my hand. So you get this very clear perception. So I'm looking at Bhante Sumano's hand, not my hand, not me. And then move your attention back to your own hand and try to keep that same perception. Notice how it shifts. The moment the attention goes to our own hand, we start thinking, oh, that's me, that's mine, that's my body, that's who I am. You look over there, not me, not mine, not who I am. You look over here, that's me, that's mine, that's who I am. Well, this is, of course, utter delusion because it's just the natural world. It's just physical components coming together. It's not, none of it is me or mine. So try to feel clearly what it's like to look at a hand as not me, not mine, and try to bring that same perception to your own hand, not me, not mine. So again, not a particularly easy practice. It actually reminds me of when I was a kid, there were these magic eye books. Anybody remember these? Bhante Sumano is nodding. Where, you know what I'm talking about? So there are these books where it'll show what looks like a just gibberish picture, like just a meaningless mm, glob of colors and shapes which don't seem to form anything sensible. But the way you look at it is first you stare at something in the distance, like a wall about 15 feet away or so, and then you move the picture in front of you while still keeping your eyes focused on the distance. And if you do this, then a three-dimensional image will appear. So I actually don't remember how this works. There's some particular way that they print these so that if your eyes are focused in the distance, then you'll get the illusion of a three-dimensional image. But what you'll notice if you're not familiar with looking at these kinds of pictures is that the moment you bring the book in front of your face, you will immediately switch to your close range vision. You'll immediately switch from long range vision to close range vision. And when you do that, then you won't see the three-dimensional image. You'll just see the same meaningless visual noise. So it takes some practice to learn how to keep that long range perception as you move a short range object into view. But if you do that, then you'll see that short range object in a completely new and different way. So similarly, that's the practice I'm recommending here. So you look at somebody else's hand and you recognize that's not me, that's not mine. So really feeling what it's like to look at a hand as not me, not mine. And then bring your own hand into view and try to keep that same perception, not me, not mine, without immediately snapping back into this is me, this is mine. So that can be a way of starting to get a handle on what anatta sanya is, the perception of not-self. I really do need to warn, by the way, the perception of not-self is phenomenally difficult. It is, in fact, the single most difficult practice in Buddhism, but it's also the practice which is directly connected with enlightenment. So the perception of impermanence is indirect in that it's a way of cultivating not-self indirectly. But the recognition of not-self is actually what causes enlightenment. So this actually is the direct practice, but that's also why it's so incredibly difficult. Another form of insight meditation, which is, it's a bit like a combination of the perception of impermanence and of not-self. And actually it's, Master Sheng Yen just directly calls it the contemplation of emptiness in a few places, the perception of emptiness. So this is silent illumination practice, which in the Japanese tradition they commonly call shikantaza, which is another phenomenally difficult practice that looks simple on its surface, but is murderously difficult to do correctly. And properly speaking, it's a combined samadhi and vipassana practice. However, most of the people I know who practice this, they're just practicing samadhi. They're just using it as a samadhi practice, or actually most commonly they're just spacing out. They're using it as a spacing out practice, which is not Buddhism, by the way. Spacing out is not Buddhism. I remember one time a man came to one of the meditation classes I was leading, and then afterwards I asked him how it went, and he was like, "Oh, I didn't need to come to this class. I already knew how to space out." And I was like, "I don't think you understood the instructions." And I never saw him at one of these classes again, by the way. Apparently that was enough Buddhism for him. Anyway, so the practice of silent illumination is the relinquishment of all phenomena. It's the simplest way to say it. Relinquish all phenomena. God, I just can't follow that up. That's too good. Yeah. Let go of all phenomena. Relinquish all phenomena. That's it. And of course, if that actually was it, we would all be enlightened by now. But in actuality, once again, we're fighting against layer after layer after layer of subconscious grasping and clinging and delusion and attachment and craving and aversion. So when I say relinquish all phenomena, on an intellectual level, we're like, oh, I get it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The whole letting go thing that those monks always say, yep, got it. But we don't get it. Let's just be realistic. We might get it on the level of Suttamaya Panya. We might even get it on the level of Chintamaya Panya. But we clearly do not get it on the level of Bhavanamaya Panya. So it has to be practiced. It has to be developed. And that takes time. It takes ongoing effort. So the practice of relinquishing all phenomena, which in the Pali tradition it's called animitta samadhi, and in the Mahayana tradition it's called silent illumination, or contemplation of emptiness, or contemplation of the middle is another term I've seen used. And in Japan they call it shikantaza, which means just sitting. Actually, it means the meaning is a bit more precise than that, but I won't go into linguistics at this time. So relinquishing all phenomena, letting go of all objects, letting go of all appearances, but while maintaining a sharp, clear, alert mind, sharp, clear, alert awareness as we let go of all things. So this practice, again, it's a way of cutting directly to the heart of the problem. But it builds upon everything else that we've been doing up to this point. So again, over the years, I've met a handful of people who say things like, oh, I just need to practice shikantaza and I'll attain enlightenment. And no, that's not quite how it works. You also need to practice generosity and morality and samadhi. If you try to skip over the foundations, then the building will not stand. If you try to leave out the support beams, then the ceiling's going to collapse. So you cannot skip over the foundations and the supports. They're an integral part of the structure. So I think I've been talking for more than long enough. I think at this time, if there's any questions, we can go ahead and take some questions. So I see there's a few more people who have joined in. So hello to Cam, Annie, Angela. Let's see, where are we at? Michael, Edward, Manuel, Kumu, Elaine, John, Joy, Bhavani. Good to see all of you. So Bhavani asks, what is meant by meditation? What is meant by contemplation? What is meant by reflection? Are they related? Did I answer that? I feel like I implicitly but not explicitly answered that. Okay. So when I use these words, and keep in mind that different teachers are going to use these words in somewhat different ways. When I talk about meditation, I'm usually talking about formal meditation practice, usually in either the sitting, walking, or standing positions, where one decides to use a particular meditation method, a particular method for training the mind, and one makes an effort to apply that method for a set period of time. That's normally what I mean by when I say meditation. When I say contemplation, I'm normally talking about, actually I use this in two ways. One is to think about something. So to think deeply about something. That's one way I use the word contemplation. Occasionally I use the word contemplation to mean directly perceiving or directly paying attention. For that I prefer to use words like perception or recognition. So usually when I say contemplation, I mean thinking about something. But sometimes I mean looking at an experience, paying close attention to an experience. And I don't normally use the word reflection at all when talking about Buddhist practice. Do I ever use the word reflection? Not really. Yeah, not really. I don't really use that word. So other teachers might use that word and you'll have to ask them what they mean by it. Joy asks, when you say deeply feel the dukkha, what do you mean? I find this slightly ironic since your name is Joy. So Joy is asking how to feel dukkha. Well, joy is also dukkha. Anyway, when I say deeply feel the dukkha, well, first off, look at your mind. Look for that feeling of discomfort in the mind. That feeling that something's not quite right. Like a splinter in your mind, to quote the Matrix. There's this feeling like a splinter in your mind. Often we don't know quite what it is. There's just this subtle feeling that something's a little bit off. Something's a little wrong with the world. Something's a little wrong with our experience. Something's not quite perfect. So that's on the subtle end of dukkha, which is always present. And of course, sometimes dukkha is much more intense. When your cat is dying, that's some pretty strong dukkha. When the pizza is not so great, well, that's moderate dukkha. But just that subtle, persistent feeling that something's a little wrong with the world, that's subtle dukkha. But dukkha is always present, unless you attain awakening. Dukkha is always present. So pay attention to it. And when I say feel it deeply, what I mean by that is don't turn away. Don't ignore it. Dive into it. And by dive into it, I mean feel it fully. So usually we try to either completely ignore dukkha, or we look at it a little bit, but we're kind of hesitant and pulling back like, no, yeah, dukkha's there. It sucks. Yeah, it sucks. So what I'm actually saying is to eyes wide open, look directly at it. It's like, yes, I see you. You're here. You're part of this reality. I'm not turning away from you. I want to know you fully and completely. So it's a mind of curiosity and acceptance, really just wanting to fully know and understand through direct personal experience what dukkha is, moment by moment. So then Kauser Friend says, perceiving body as other is not the correct way of perceiving not self, right? Like, it is possible to disassociate to the point where one does not recognize body as self, but still as a self. I don't think I understand your question. Yeah, the Buddha actually does say perceive the body as other. He says perceive the body as alien, as other. He does say that. And yeah, it is interesting that even when you're perceiving the body as other, as not me, as alien, there is still a sense of self. So then the question is, well, if the body is not self, if self is not the body, if self is not in the body, then what is it that I think self is? Where do I think myself is? So you start digging a bit deeper. Because of course the root of our self-identity is not the body. It's something deeper than that. The body is simply the coarsest manifestation of self-identity. So yeah, absolutely yes. Perceiving not self does in fact often begin with perceiving the body as other. Yes, that is correct. And yeah, it is possible to get to the point where you recognize that the body is not self. Yeah. Okay, Kauser Friend gives a clarification. He says, I mean, one can perceive one's own body as a different person, which is still a person. Perceive one's body as a different person, which is still a person. You're complicating things too much. Don't perceive it as a different person. Just perceive it as a body which is not you. Don't project the concept of person onto it. One of my favorite lines from the Diamond Sutra, and this gets repeated over and over again. In the Diamond Sutra, it says, a bodhisattva does not form the concept of person. So don't get into concepts of persons. It's not relevant. But just recognizing there is the experience of a body, but it is not me. It is not mine. It is not who I am. It is other than me. It is alien. Okay? Ayavim Lanyani says, thanks for teaching the technique to look at someone else's hand and transferring the perception to one's own. It was eye-opening. So I'm happy that you enjoyed that instruction, Venerable. And I hope that you come visit the monastery someday. Then Angela asks, could you point us down the right path of action/thought when we encounter someone who we see causes suffering all around them? Well, first thing is to have compassion for that person. Because they're also, well, first off, they are expressing their own deep-set suffering and delusion by inflicting suffering on others. That's a manifestation of their own suffering. And second, they're creating even more suffering for themselves. So that kind of person is like when you see somebody who is terribly ill, someone whose body is covered with open sores, someone who's rotting out, rotting from the inside out, and yet refuses to see a doctor. You see a person like that and you know there's not much you can do because this person is an utter mess inside and out and they don't even realize it. So have compassion for them. First and foremost, have compassion. There's a lovely sutta, the Agata Pativinaya Sutta, the sutta on removing resentment. One of my favorite suttas. And in it, the Buddha talks about 4 kinds of people. And one of the 4 kinds of people is the person who doesn't seem to have any wholesome qualities of body and mind at all. And the Buddha says you should see that person like somebody who is lying on the side of a road far away from any village or town with no one to help them, and that person is desperately ill and there's nobody who can do anything for them. And he says when you see that kind of person, you arouse a mind of compassion and you wish for their well-being. You sincerely wish, I hope that person gets some good medicine. I hope they get a good doctor. I hope they get a good attendant who will take care of them. Because otherwise, they're heading for a severe disaster. So that's the kind of mind to have towards a person like that. You see them as somebody who is terribly, terribly sick and somebody who is very difficult to help. And you might not be the person to help them. But also look and see if maybe there is something you can do. Maybe there is something you can do to help that person learn a little bit of kindness and compassion, learn a little bit of self-awareness. And also look to see what you can do for the victims of that person. Look to see how you can help the people who are being harmed by that person. What you can do to alleviate their distress and help them to be cared for and looked after. So those are opportunities for practicing compassion. So compassion is not just a mind state. Compassion is an activity. So when you encounter those kinds of situations, that's the time for the activity of compassion. So those are my thoughts. So that's the end of the questions on YouTube. Anything from the monastery residents?
Bhante, what would you say is the difference between apanihito samadhi and animitta samadhi, if there is a difference?
That's a great question. So Bhante Sumino is asking, what is the difference between apanihita samadhi and animitta samadhi? So animitta samadhi is objectless concentration. Apanihita samadhi is undirected concentration. And the truth is they're actually the same thing. Yeah. They're just different ways of saying the same thing. And actually the Buddha says this himself in the suttas. He says they're just different words for the same thing. But it's the approach is a little bit different. So the effect is the same, but the approach is a bit different. So with animitta samadhi, we're focusing on letting go of all appearances, letting go of all objects. So relinquishing all objects. With apanihita samadhi, we're relinquishing all activities. So you're not directing the mind towards any particular activity. You're letting go of all activities. So it winds up coming to the same thing because objects and activities are actually the same in the end, but they look different at the beginning. So are you going to start by focusing on relinquishing objects or on relinquishing activities? That will determine whether you're practicing animitta samadhi or apanihita samadhi. But either way, you wind up at the same point, which is relinquishing all phenomena. Okay?
Follow up.
Go ahead.
So I've tried both, and to some degree I've had success. But I also find that sometimes there's this subtle or not so subtle feeling that there's a danger or risk in letting, I mean, you spoke about it a little bit, but like this sense that I have to hold on to at least something. I can't fully let go of whatever it is. And sometimes that feeling comes up of like, I don't know, like it's a responsibility that I have to the world or something like in my head that's just saying, you can let go of 99% of things, but that 1% you have to really hold tightly to. And if you don't, then disaster or whatever. And so usually when I hit that point, it's then, well, everything unravels because then I can't actually let go. So I don't know if you have any words.
Yeah. So this is actually natural. It's natural that as we're practicing relinquishing all phenomena, that eventually we'll hit something that we're not willing to relinquish. That's natural. And it's like running up against a wall. You hit it and you're like, I just can't do it. I can't do it. And you back off a little bit. And eventually you come up against the wall again. You're like, I can't do it. I can't do it. You back off. Eventually you come up against it and you're like, maybe I can let go a little bit. And the wall starts to melt away a little bit. And then you're like, no, gotta hold on. And you pull back. You come up against it again and the wall melts a little bit more. And eventually one day you'll come up against that and you'll realize there was never a wall there in the first place. And you'll find another wall beyond that one. But eventually you'll come to the end of all walls. At least that's the Buddha's promise to us. And that's the direct approach. You can also use contemplations. I actually find the line from the Kachanagota Sutta, dukkhameva upajamanang upajjati, dukkhameva nirujjamanang nirujjati. I find that really helpful because it's like, well, whatever I'm clinging to is just dukkha. I'm just clinging to dukkha. I think it's important to hang on to this thing, but it's just dukkha that I'm hanging on to fundamentally. So why am I so unwilling to let go of dukkha? And the other thing also to keep in mind is that whatever you're letting go of, you can just pick it up again afterwards if you want to. So you're not really losing anything because you can just pick it up again later. So it's like, okay, yeah, the whole saving the world thing is awesome, but I'm going to put it down for 5 minutes and I'll pick it up again in 5 minutes. Okay, does that help? Okay. Anything else? Michael asked to repeat the Sutta of the 4 types of persons. It's called Agata Pativinaya Sutta. I should probably type that out. Can you do diacritics on your keyboard?
I don't know how to explain it, so.
Oh.
Because it's key combinations.
Removing resentment. Just look up the sutta of removing resentment. It's not hard to find. So I'll type it in without diacritics, even though that desperately hurts my sensibilities.
Relinquish all phenomena.
I know, right now I'm relinquishing attachment to properly spelling Pali words. So the sutta on removing resentment, I actually don't remember off the top of my head where it is in the suttas. It's on my website, and of course it's on Sutta Central if you look on Sutta Central. Anyway, I think that's it for now.
Bhante, I find it fascinating that Bhante Suddhaso, he pretty much asked the same question I was going to ask, except I was going to throw in all three from the Chula Vedala Sutta, the emptiness, the Apanahita, Animita. And I was going to point out, you're the first person, thank you, I've heard point out the connection between silent illumination and animita, silenceless or objectlessness. But with the third, that's why I say you pretty much answered it. The third, emptiness, you say this is another way of coming to it. You said the objectless and the aimlessness coming from a different starting point.
So, so Brother Dongdai Min is bringing in then the third of the three meditation techniques. These are normally given as a triad. So Animitta Samadhi, Apanahita Samadhi, and Sunyata Samadhi. So objectless Samadhi, undirected Samadhi, and emptiness Samadhi. And actually the Buddha says that all three of these are just different ways of approaching the same thing. So the way I think of it, so as I said, Animitta Samadhi is letting go of objects. Apanahita Samadhi is letting go of activities. I would say that Sunyata Samadhi is actually in the middle. It's letting go of everything all at once. So of the three, Sunyata Samadhi is the most direct, which, as with all direct practices, it also means it's the most difficult. And again, Master Sheng Yen actually directly calls silent illumination practice Sunyata Samadhi, the direct experience of Sunyata. Okay, so I think that's it for this morning. I hope that wasn't too intimidating. So Vipassana practice is, of course, very challenging. So there's nothing wrong with focusing on your foundations, because the stronger your foundations are, then the easier it will be to develop insight at some point in the future. So we'll go ahead and end the morning with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And see you this evening for the last of this series of talks.